Hi, my name is Chris, though you might recognize my voice from another channel called Stoehovve, where I do various tutorial videos for Fantasy Grounds Unity. In collaboration with Smiteworks, I'm going to provide an update on how to use the combat tracker with respect to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons from a Dungeon Master's point of view. One of the most important features within Fantasy Grounds Unity is the combat tracker itself. It is used to control the flow of a given encounter and integrates with many aspects of Fantasy Grounds Unity that simplify the process of handling specific kinds of encounters. As a Dungeon Master, you will use aspects of the combat tracker far more than what a player will, so it's important to get a good understanding of how it works and to ensure optimal use. Additionally, as a Dungeon Master, you're going to see far more in the way of information within the combat tracker than what a player sees. Because of this, I will be publishing 3 videos for this particular series. One that is explaining the combat tracker from a player's point of view, one, which is this one, from a Dungeon Master's point of view, and then I'm going to show a third video that shows an actual encounter going through, but simultaneously showing both points of view. There is one thing that I want to point out about this video though, is that I'm not going to be showing how the settings affect how the combat tracker itself functions. I've already recorded a series that covers those settings, but I will be sure to provide a link to those videos in the description below. As a Dungeon Master, you already know that one of the more painful parts of a role-playing session is handling the combat encounters. And while they are still fun to run through, they can be hard to manage. There's a huge amount of information that has to be tracked, and some of those examples might be something like this. What is the order of combat? Who goes when? What can an NPC do? What attacks does it have? Are there any spells? Or are there any special features? Maybe it has lair actions. Are there conditions that are attached to a player or NPC that have to come into play? Are they blinded? Are they blessed? Are there special effects tied to a given player or NPC that are going to affect a spell as I cast it? What is the state of everyone's health? Did that NPC just take enough damage to be killed off, or did that player just get knocked unconscious? And that's just to name a few, and depending on the encounter, there could be more or less things to track. It's all going to come down to the type of encounter that you're running through. How the combat tracker comes into play is that it's used to help you centralize all of that information into a single pane or panel, in addition to controlling the flow of a given encounter. And we'll look at how that works when we get into the panel itself and start explaining a little bit more of its detail. The combat tracker is a panel that is going to be accessed via the icons here in the upper right portion of Fantasy Grounds itself. If you don't see it, there's a good chance it's because the tool menu here is not expanded down. And the one that you're looking for is this icon here that has got the crossed swords in it. And if you hover over it, you will see a little helper tool pop up stating combat tracker. When you open it up, chances are it's going to be empty if this is the first time that you're opening it up. I'm going to go ahead and add our player character here so that you can see a little bit more in the way of context as we go through and start explaining some of the information that we're going to see here. I've also added an NPC because there are some subtle differences between a player versus an NPC that I want to point out fairly early on in this particular part of the video. With a creature and a player in this case, now in the combat tracker, we can see a little bit more context, if you will, when it comes to the top of this header and how it relates to the information below it. Every box represents what are called actors inside the combat tracker. And all of the actors that are added to this combat tracker will be taking part of or will be related to the encounter in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't matter whether a creature is hostile, neutral, has no faction associated with it, or is allied with the party members. There are going to be some contextual differences that come into play, and we will cover those as we go. The first thing that I want to go over is NPC Visibility, and that is controlled by a couple of toggles. One of the more major ones is right here in the upper left corner of the screen, or panel, I should say. This icon here will control the visibility state of all of the individual NPCs that are added to the combat tracker, such that when you click this, it's going to toggle the state of this hide NPC icon that you see here on our adult Black Dragon. But at the same time, if I had 30 NPCs that were added to this combat tracker, it would toggle the state of all of those. At some point, it's going to align the states, so you either have them visible or invisible in relation to how the player sees them within the combat tracker. This icon does have a little bit of a risk though. If you've added creatures to this combat tracker that are not yet on a visible portion of the battlefield, you might accidentally expose them if you click this icon rather than the individual NPC icons that you see here. So you'll want to be cognizant of that so that you don't accidentally spoil a little bit of the surprise of, oh, there are more orcs that are coming in. You're going to want to ensure that you don't click this when you're trying to ensure that a few NPCs remain hidden and act as a later surprise as the combat continues. This is why you have individual NPC visibility control. Now, if you happen to have only one NPC and you toggle this, then the state of this is going to update to reflect that. But if you have multiple NPCs, and I'll do that a little bit later on when I add more, and you toggle the individual NPCs, then what will happen is that this won't necessarily change, and the state of the individual actors, if you will be updated so that they're now visible to the players. The next element I wanted to discuss relates to a little bit more information around the NPCs and the players themselves. This is going to be the character token, and whether it's for a player or whether it's for an NPC or object of some kind, it's going to relate to what might be displayed in a map, and you'll see what that looks like when we get to the sample encounter. And what it will do is it will help you identify which particular NPC this relates to, with one catch. If you happen to have 10 of the same creature on the map at the same time, so let's say 10 orcs, then trying to match this icon to one of the orcs that is specifically the one you want to attack isn't going to work. You'll have to use the name, which hopefully by this time is unique and not just orc for all 10 of them, in order to be able to ensure that you target the right one. Although generally as the Dungeon Master, you're not targeting the orcs, you're targeting the players. So for your job, it becomes a little bit easier. But managing those orcs when you're going through turn and movement capabilities as well as who's attacking what, that's where it can get a little bit confusing from your point of view. One of the other things that you have the capability to do as the Dungeon Master is control whether a creature is identified or not. Normally this would be preset before the creature gets added into the combat tracker, but typically when you go through and just grab an NPC from here and drop it into place, it's automatically going to be identified to the player. So you'll very quickly, before you make it visible, want to make sure that it's not identified if it's a creature they've never run into before. And you simply click on it to toggle that state. So a red circle hovering over the ID entry that is in that particular circle indicates that it's not identified, and this is what the players will see. And if there are multiple unidentified creatures, there should be a prefix that shows up after it, or suffix rather, that shows up after it. If it's identified, however, it will show them the actual name of the creature. And this could be orc, this could be adult black dragon, this could be an aberrant NPC of some kind that has a very complicated name that I can never pronounce, usually the Illithids, for example. But the reason why identification comes into play is if a player or a party has no knowledge of the creature, they're not going to understand what its weaknesses or what its strengths are in relation to how best to attack it. Whereas if they've identified a creature, they've probably run up against it a couple of times and know enough by this point to be able to understand how to deal with it. And that's really how the identification component comes into play. The other factor is that you can hide it from the player, not the characters, but the player themselves, because they're not going to know what that creature is until you expose it to them. Thus, they're not going to be able to game the system by knowledge that they themselves have accrued over the years of any role-playing that they've done. And next to that is the name of the creature. So whether they're identified, whether they're not identified, whether it's a player, whether it's an object or vehicle of some kind, if it's in the combat tracker, it's going to have a name. If there are multiple creatures, hopefully they have unique names. So there might be a numerical suffix that's added to it, say orc 1, orc 2, orc 3, to allow things to be identified. But there are extensions that do allow you to provide kind of like the equivalent of a boss name to characters, but it's a randomly generated one. So you might have pig leg orc. I had a combat situation once where I was using that extension and I ended up having a gassy pudding. Figure that one out. Now, before we move off of this area, there's something that I want to point out here. It's very difficult to see, and hopefully it comes through on the recording, but there's a little circular pip that's here just along the border of the combat tracker, and it's going to have one for every actor that is in the combat tracker. This is called the action indicator or turn indicator. and it links directly to this icon that you find here at the bottom left portion of the combat tracker, such that when you drop it into place, that now becomes the active actor in a given turn. I generally will call it an action indicator, turn indicator, or action token, and generally it comes down to the mood that I'm in, but all three of those are accurate descriptions as to what this is supposed to represent. And you don't necessarily have to click and drag this up there. You can actually go ahead and just simply click on that pip and it will move the turn indicator to that particular actor. Doesn't matter how you do it, but once you do that, you'll see that there's this thicker version of the background color that wraps around the box. This is an indication to you and to the players that that particular actor has the active turn. If this happens to be their player character, then it's going to be them that are going to get a chance to go. And when that happens, they're going to hear a chime on their side if you've got that turned on, or even if they have that turned on. And the other way that this gets controlled is if you use this next actor icon. So if you click this, it will rotate through the various actors that happen to be within the combat tracker. Now, in this case, I only have 2 actors. So as I do this, the turn indicator here is consistently going up. I'm going to reset that, or not next round, rather. I'm just going to simply clear that out to put us back into a fresh start here, if you will. The last thing I want to mention about this turn indicator is that as the Dungeon Master, chances are if it's a red box, yellow box, or has no coloration in the box here at all, you're the one that controls the character. If it's a green box, and there's a player associated with that particular creature or character or NPC, then they're going to control that. But if it's a very specific NPC that happens to be allied with the party members, there's a good chance you'll be controlling that. So you'll have to be cognizant as to which situation comes into play and when you're the one controlling it versus when the players are controlling it. The next 4 boxes here show a lot of important information for each of the creatures and players that are going to be shown within the combat tracker, including objects as well. The first field here, however, represents the initiative or the combat order in which combat is going to occur in. And every creature, every object, and every NPC and player is going to have an initiative roll unless they're just coming into the combat and don't necessarily have something rolled for them yet. But it's always going to indicate the order that combat is going to occur in from highest to lowest. You can see here that this character has an 11, or creature I should say, and our player character doesn't have one at all. If a 22 was added into this particular situation, then what's going to happen is that our player character will go first and the dragon will go second. There are a couple of things that I do want to point out with this particular setup though. If you happen to have a tie, then the combat tracker is going to examine who has the highest dexterity between the 2 creatures that have a tied value, and then choose the creature that has that highest value. Meaning that if we both rolled an 11, but the adult black dragon had a dexterity of 3 and the barbarian had a dexterity of 4, then the barbarian would be ordered first. And there's one more condition where you could still have a tie. If you happen to have a tie on the initiative roll and a tie on the dexterities between the 2 creatures that are tied, the next way that Fantasy Grounds is going to organize it is alphabetically, and it's going to be based off of the identified name. So if the players have no idea what this is, it will still be ordered in front of the barbarian because it's actually called an adult black dragon. So it's going to see the A in adult black dragon and order it that way. It doesn't care that it's not an identified creature from the player's point of view. If the combat tracker is configured to re-roll initiative rolls at the end of a round, then what it will do then is it will handle that automatically for you, re-rolling both NPCs and player initiatives, and then reorganize the order of the creatures in that list based on the new set of rolls. But as a Dungeon Master, you can also force a new set of rolls. If you go to the menu option down here and select the 9 o'clock position here for initiative, there are a number of options that you have here that will allow you to roll specific initiatives. So you could roll it for everybody, roll it for just NPCs, that would be non-player controlled characters. So if I have 6 players up there, their characters would not have their initiatives rolled. Or I can do the opposite. I can roll all of the player character initiatives, but leave those for the NPCs left alone. There is also the option to clear the initiatives, and that's what this circular icon here represents. This represents going back a menu, but this will actually clear the initiatives. The next 3 fields represent a creature or player's health status, showing you their total number of hit points, what their temporary number of hit points are, and how many wounds they've received. The value within the total number of hit points here is only going to change if a character has leveled up, or an NPC is somehow requiring adjustment by the Dungeon Master. But for the most part, these are going to be static, and it's going to be a cue to players who are allied with this particular party member that, oh, they're suffering quite badly in relation to the total number of hit points that they've received. Players aren't necessarily going to see these kinds of details, and you'll see that if you watch the player video. Temporary hit points, on the other hand, are going to be added, they're going to be removed, they're going to not necessarily change, although if you suffer damage that is less than the total number of temporary hit points that your character has, then it's going to drop by that total amount. So it could theoretically change in that respect, yes. But this is going to be hit points that are taken off first. So if you have 10 hit points and you're hit for 11 points of damage, all 10 of the temporary hit points are going to go away, and you will gain 1 wound when it comes to the damage. As a player, NPC, object, or vehicle of any kind starts to suffer more and more damage, their wounds are going to increment, meaning that they're going to go up. So for every 10 points of damage you suffer, you would see 10 additional points added to the total wounds. Once it gets to a point where the number of wounds is equal to the total maximum hit points that a character has, or an NPC has, what'll happen is one of two things. A player is going to simply be knocked unconscious unless they suffered so much in the way of their maximum amount of damage they received that it exceeds double what their total number of hit points are, then they're going to be killed outright. But for an NPC or vehicle or some other form of object, when their wounds is equal to the total number of hit points that they have, they're going to be instantly killed. Unless you as the Dungeon Master say, oh, they're going to need that particular NPC to move the story forward, so I'm going to give them the chance to save them. Fantasy Grounds can be set up to automatically remove killed NPCs out of the combat tracker. I tend to disable that because I do periodically run into situations where I want the players to try to save an NPC because that NPC has information that they might be looking for. Wounds, however, don't always have to go up. If an NPC or player character or vehicle received some form of healing, so in the case of a vehicle, it would be repairs, then the wounds are going to go down. So if you are at 30 wounds for this particular creature, this particular player, and then you are healed for 31 hit points, then all the wounds are going to go away. But if you are healed for 28 hit points, you're still going to have 3 hit points in the wounds category. The next group of fields that we're going to cover are a bit of a mixture of utilitarian as well as informational, and the first of which controls the faction. You might be asking, what is a faction? Well, in this case, it's a simplified representation of how a given actor relates to a particular player member or party. There are 4 possible factions that Fantasy Grounds supports. None, which means that that particular actor isn't allied with anybody or has no faction association whatsoever. Hostile, which is this reddish colored background that you see here, as well as this red skull. This is the faction indicator here. Neutral means that it's going to be yellow, and it will be neutral in respect to the player's point of view, but not necessarily in respect to hostile creatures that might happen to be on the field. And an ally or friend is going to be green. So players are always going to be friends or allies, and their backgrounds are always going to be green. When a player is technically charmed or dominated by an NPC, then you would choose their faction or change their faction rather to be a hostile during that particular duration. And as you just saw there, you can toggle a faction simply by clicking on the icon that is here, or you can pick and drag a faction representation from down here at the bottom. How you choose to do it is entirely up to you. I find it's usually quicker just to do this, depending on whether I have a really long list and there's a creature down here. It might just be as quick to drag the faction icon from there. But you'll notice that you can't get the no faction or non-faction. So if you click here, this 4th selection, there is a distinct discoloration in relation to this red background here that you may not be noticing. A, the skull is black, and B, the coloration of the background is the same as the panel. Whereas here, it's red. And it is the faction that dictates the background color, in case you hadn't already picked up on that. Now, of course, this does assume that the theme that you might be running hasn't changed the coloration of the backgrounds here. I don't know if that's actually possible. I don't develop themes for fantasy realms, so I honestly do not know if it's possible to do. The last thing I want to mention about this is that it is possible to preset a faction through an encounter option that you have here before creatures get loaded into the combat tracker. And the encounter that I have set up shows an example of how that works. Next to the faction icon, we have this circular icon. And you are the only one who gets to expand this list out. This does not exist for players. Although it might be something that can be toggled for them, generally it's not there. What this area shows is a complete tokenified listing of all of the targets of a particular actor. And this will change. So if someone is making use of a single melee attack to attack a creature, chances are they're only going to have one creature targeted. However, if someone is lobbing a fireball into a group of creatures, there's going to be multiple creatures that get targeted as part of that selection. As a dungeon master, you have two key methods that you can make use of in order to acquire a lock on a target. I'm going to go ahead and put the action token here to simplify this. But now that I have the action token here, and that is key, it will only work for whoever happens to have the active action token from a dungeon master's point of view, not from a player's point of view, but from a dungeon master's point of view. And all you have to do is hold down the control key and click on a particular actor in the combat tracker. You can also click on the token of that actor in the map. The other option is to drag and drop this onto a given target. So if I clear the target list and I drag this down and target that barbarian, you can see that it gets added to the list. The one thing I do want to point out about this is that when you have the target list expanded out like this, you will not see a textual representation of the targets. You have to actually close that in order to see which specifically the targets represent. If you hover over the icon, you get to do that. But if you just want a quick text representation of who or what is targeted, you can just simply leave that disabled and see the list down here at the bottom of the actions listing. And I've intentionally moved the token onto the barbarian here so that you can see that even if an active creature that had actually gone through and targeted something is moved on to another character, so the action tokens move forward, the target list remains, regardless of whether you have it expanded out or not. So it will always have something in this list. Now, the last thing that I want to point out about this is this clear target icon. It doesn't have to be done with an active actor. You can clear the list of someone who has no longer got the action token. But it's a very quick, clean way to remove all targets that happen to be selected by that particular actor. Another aspect that I want to point out about the targets here is that when you're going through a combat-based situation, so if I put the action token here, there's a number of things that can be done. You can make an attack roll, you can force a saving throw, you can apply effects, etc., etc. In relation to attacks, if you make an attack and you miss, there's a chance that that target might be deselected depending on how the combat tracker is configured. Generally, though, it won't deselect them if it's just simply a miss. You'll see that that particular target remains, although in this case, I rolled a hit in this particular case. Generally, though, it's very hard to miss with a dragon. So let me see if I can get a miss here. Yeah, there we go. You can see that we still have the target listed here. Saves, on the other hand, work a little bit differently. If there is a saving throw that comes into play and a particular target manages to succeed on that saving throw, there are two scenarios that can be triggered. The first relate to any saving throw that happens to have a half damage indicated. You'll see that with an H here in the representation or in the information sheet specific to the creature. So if I pop this open and I scroll down to the breath weapon, which should be right here, you will see that there's a half as much damage reference here in relation to this particular saving throw. When that happens, targets will remain selected until the damage has been done. Oh my, that's a lot of damage. And you can see that that target went away. The second will relate to saving throws that deal with damage. So you can see this one here doesn't have that half damage representation, meaning that if a creature manages to succeed on the saving throw, they're not going to suffer any damage at all. It won't do it for effects or anything else that is going to simply apply an effect. What will happen though is if this barbarian succeeds on a saving throw, meaning they rolled a 19 or higher in this case, or, well, that's a half damage one, then they would not suffer damage. Therefore, they would be deselected before you roll the damage. It will automatically be removed from this target list. Now, a dexterity of 19 on this barbarian has been extremely difficult to roll. I've tried 28 times so far, and I have yet to succeed. And I've done most of that off screen because this guy has a pretty poor dexterity save. But anyway, that's essentially what would happen. So let's surmise that this was actually a 19. Then what would happen is this would pop away. You would then roll your damage against the creatures that still happen to be there, and then they would suffer those points of damage, but the barbarian would not. And I don't know if I alluded to this earlier or not, but the control left-clicking functionality only works for the active actor. I can't select the control for the barbarian and try to target this particular creature, because all that's going to happen is that I'm going to target myself. And that's not what we want in this case. We wanted something like this, where the barbarian targeted our creature. As you might know, creatures and players within Dungeons & Dragons might have different sizes, ranging from tiny through to gargantuan in nature. Fantasy Grounds allows you to change that size on the fly, making use of the size and reach option, which is this icon here, to be able to adjust the size of a given creature as well as their reach. Both of these values are something that you as the Dungeon Master can adjust. For example, if you happen to have a player that's making use of a bugbear, chances are their reach isn't 5, but is probably 10 feet in distance. Generally though, when it comes to adding NPCs or players into the combat tracker, the size is already picked up, although sometimes you have to adjust the size of the creature, or the player rather. The reach is always going to default to 5. I don't understand why that is the case. Maybe it's because the reach isn't always necessarily static in reference to the incoming attacks that creatures can sometimes do, but I've never seen this reach value adjust. So it's something that you have to manipulate before you make an attack that might happen to have a longer reach. And sometimes you don't even need to do that. It only comes into play when you run into a situation, for example, where this range definition isn't defined as part of the attack. I actually didn't even know that that was possible, but it's nice to know that it is. So when this is created, it's being automatically calculated off of the contextual text that is here, so that it will automatically add that range factor there. Thus, when you make this attack, it's automatically behind the scenes going to adjust this to a 15 before it completes and executes that attack. Thus, it guarantees it's a melee-based attack. That's what this M represents here. I believe that might be different from an older version of Fantasy Grounds called Fantasy Grounds Classic. I don't think that was automatically calculated, but I could be wrong. It has been 4 years since I last used it almost. Now, under what situations would you want to adjust this size? An example might be that a particular character has cast Enlarge on our barbarian here. Well, that would increase the size of that barbarian based on the size defined by the spell. So you would want to increase that particular size from the barbarian, probably going from medium to large. So that would be a 10 in relation to the size. But I actually don't have many players cast Enlarge, so I've never really had to fiddle with this that often, but it is there for you if you need to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that, and then we'll take a look at the next field. The next field is the offensive field, and you may have noticed that when I enabled this for this active NPC, nothing changed. And that's because when you as the Dungeon Master are controlling a particular creature or player or whatever, as that action token plops down into their position, their actions are already going to be exposed for you. You don't have to worry about toggling this. But if you're curious as to what information is available for players, you can click on this, and other NPCs that might not be active, you can also click on those to see details specific to them. Now, there is going to be some information that is different between the players. What you see here versus what you see here is that we have a reaction that we haven't yet used. We have a +1 to our initiative roll. We have an armor class of 18, and this barbarian has a speed of 35 feet. That's the information that you will see here, although you can see other things if they have the ability to fly, swim, etc., etc. When it comes to creatures, once again, you can see whether they have used a reaction, what their bonuses are for their initiative, what their armor class is, but then you have this DT field. If you're not familiar with what that is, it was added as a more permanent adjustment in relation to Spelljammer, but what it is damage threshold. So there's a specific damage threshold that you must hit an object with in order for that object to actually suffer damage. If the damage threshold was 10, then you would have to hit with a 10 or higher in order for that damage to apply to the target. Now, technically, it's always been there, but it is now more permanent because it's now a permanent fixture within the NPC stat sheet. It used to be something that you had to add on your own. The other thing about this is that their speed is referenced here as well. So what their walking speed is, in this case, they also have a fly and swimming speed. So you'll see that information here. Other elements are going to pop up depending on the kind of creature. Are there traits that they can make use of? Are there actions? Are there things that define actions? So even though multi-tack is not directly an action, it tells you how to use the actions. Are there legendary actions that come into play? And it gives you a summary of everything that's associated with that, as well as what their lair actions might happen to be. And all of that is listed here. You don't see that for a player because chances are you're not controlling that player. You will see something for an allied NPC though, and it might be similar to this, although it won't necessarily have legendary actions or lair actions, but it will have actions and possibly a few traits. You can simply use these elements here to execute the attacks as I was showing earlier. So I could actually simply make an attack roll by dragging and dropping that onto the barbarian. The other option, because if I target the barbarian, I can simply double click and actually do the same thing and it will attack that barbarian. There are definitely different ways that you can go through and execute different kinds of things. You can even apply effects to creatures who manage to fail on their saving throw, for example. Before we move on, I want to just point out a couple of other things. Multi-attack will define as to which attacks it's going to apply to. So in this case, it's the bite and claws, which means I can bite once and swipe with 2 claws. But if I execute this tail attack, that's the action. You don't get to do the bite or the claw attack. With respect to legendary actions, there are costs that come into play. So you have to have an X number of points in order to be able to make use of this wing attack, for example. And then there's lair actions. Lair actions themselves are triggered generally on an initiative roll of 20. So if our adult dragon here happened to have an initiative roll of 15, you can still theoretically execute a lair action if the time is appropriate to do so. And your initiative is at, say, 20 already. So if you have a character who's got an initiative roll of 21 and the dragon at 15, before the dragon gets to go, you can execute the lair actions. The next informational element that comes into play is your defense information, and this is represented by this fist icon for both players and NPCs and objects. And what it does is it summarizes things like the creature or character stats. Objects as well are summarized there. It gives you a listing of all of the overall vulnerabilities. You can use these stats to trigger different kinds of checks. So you'll see here that it's a check, not a saving throw. You can also get a complete listing of what damage or condition immunities happen to exist when it comes to this particular creature. In this case, they're immune to acid damage. You do have the ability to temporarily modify these values. So I can change this to a 15, for example, although I'm not going to. I don't want to keep it that way. But you do have the ability to temporarily add damage vulnerabilities to it. Maybe a spell added a vulnerability to the dragon, which is going to open up additional attacks for the party to be able to hit that dragon. Maybe they've gained some resistances due to a layer effect or some other kind of special capability that they now have the ability to do because you've customized that dragon to be able to do so. In addition, what conditional immunities? Are they immune to things like fear or poison or things like that? And to be clear, poison is a type of damage. Poisoned would be the condition in this case. For the most part, however, short of being able to execute the ability checks, this is mostly informational for both the players and for the NPCs. You can see here that with the players, you can only see their stats. And yes, that barbarian does have a 24 strength. But the point here is that this is mostly going to be an informational reference for you so that you don't have to always pop open the character sheet to see what's going on here or what's in this list. It's all right here. The icon here that looks like a stunned head of some kind is the effects. Now, if there's an effect in place, you will always have an effect representation listed here at the bottom for both players and NPCs. But if you expand this out, that representation disappears and you get a summary effect listing, if you will, in this. And it will be a number of lines that show the individual effects here, as well as controls associated with that effect. You gain the ability to remove an effect, so you can delete this particular effect, as well as add custom effects. And that includes the ability to drag and drop effects from here and drop them onto a particular creature. They will show up in this list. So if I, for instance, drag and drop that onto here, we can now see that they have that effect there. It will always indicate who it was applied by or what it was applied by based on the active actor in the combat turn. On each effect, there's going to be a series of controls that are over here on the left side of the effect. And they are toggles. And you can see this on, this GM, and this all reference here. Whereas here it's on and visible, that's what VSBL is, and roll. The on button enables the functions of the effects itself to be toggled. So if an effect is temporarily disabled for a player or creature, you as the Dungeon Master can go ahead and simply force it to skip for that turn or completely turn it off. And as a summary representation, on means that the effects are going to be active with respect to the creature they're attached to. Skip means that it's going to skip for that turn, but if there's a round tracker here, it's still going to count down. Off, on the other hand, turns the effect off and also disables the ability of the effect to count down on its turn. So there's not going to be a counter that gets removed from here. Generally, though, most effects are always going to be on unless there's some form of special kind of condition that comes into play. An example would be that this Berserker class Barbarian does have the ability to become immune to charmed and frightened effects when they're raged and make use of one of their class specialization specific features. When it comes to the visibility of an effect, as a GM, you can control whether players see this or not. In this particular case, this is a very special effect that is unique to dragons and other creatures that have a breath weapon. As such, it only makes sense for the GM to be able to see that. VSBL, however, indicates that it's visible to all. So it'll be visible to all players, it'll be visible to all NPCs and the GM, anything like that. Players will not see anything that is toggled to be set as GM only. Now, the roll effect is a little bit more complicated. It changes things so that you can do a number of little things. It's a toggle that has 4 states. The first one being roll or one roll, apply each once, all rolls, or action. And in this case, I believe that was set to all. And how this works is as follows. One roll is going to trigger on the next roll that the creature or player makes, and then it's going to go away. So if I set this to one roll and then I roll this damage, this effect is going to go away on the first creature if you happen to have multiple creatures that are targeted. SNGL is the next one. And how this works is based entirely on how many operators, if you will, are within a given effect. So I look at these as an operator. So it's an operation changing how the attack works. It's an operation on how the damage is being affected. For each operation that occurs, it will fall off. So if I have this barbarian make an attack roll against the dragon, you will see that the ATK portion of that has gone away. Now, because I've hit, if I roll the damage, we will see that the damage has also gone away and the effect in its entirety itself has gone away. The next option is all. And what this is going to apply to is all rolls, but it will only apply to the rolls that match the operation. So ATK plus 1 here will apply to all attack rolls. DMG plus 2 will apply to all damage rolls. You won't get the plus 2 for any attack roll that happens. At the same time, this effect isn't going to go away until 1 round later. So if this was a permanent effect, it would look something like this. Most likely all is going to be there, and then you'd have a string of effects. Generally, that's when all is applied, is when there is an effect or a trait or a modifier that your character has received through a feature that permanently adjusts something. The last one is a little bit trickier, and it's the one action option. And how this works is as follows. If you make an attack and you happen to have 10 creatures targeted, the attack +1 here would apply. There is a catch though. Watch what happens when I attack this dragon. The effect goes away. You're not gaining the benefit of the +2 to the damage. When you're dealing with a one action based item, it's got to be very, very specific as to what it's going to apply to. Its condition is that unlike roll, it will apply bonuses to all of your targeted creatures. Next to the description of the various effects, you will have these two input boxes. One represents the duration, and one represents the initiative to adjust that duration on. What that means is that if you have an initiative of 13 here, when the initiative continues to count down, so let's say that we have a 21 here and a 15 here, then what will happen is that this adjustment will occur after the barbarian has gone, but potentially before another creature that might have an initiative of 9 down below itself has gone. However, if it was this creature that applied the effect to this creature, then the initiative roll will be equal to whatever the initiative is here. The round is literally just a decrementer, meaning that it will count down. If this was 10 rounds, if that was 10 rounds, it would simply count down 10 rounds before the effect falls off. If it was 100 rounds, it would be around for 100 rounds before it falls off. And you'll usually see a D reference here with respect to that, telling you how many rounds are left or what its duration is. This can get a little bit more complicated though, and I've got an example of that I'm going to demonstrate. So what I've got here is an effect that I've applied and it's going to expire after 1 round. When I advance our character forward, you'll see that it has gone away. And that's because of the 0 that we had there at the end of that particular turn. When you have a 0 in that field, so right here, if that's a 0, it's always going to expire at the end of the round. So that's a good way to indicate that something is supposed to fall off when the round itself starts back at the beginning. Now, this effect was supplied by the adult dragon. What that means is that when the turn moves to the dragon, watch what happens to the effect on the barbarian. It goes away. If it was meant to last to the end of the turn associated with the creature, obviously that has now just violated that retention period, if you will. This is the trick on how to go about doing that. At the end of the turn, so if I advance this, that turn's going to stick around. Before the turn for the dragon comes again, what you want to do is identify what the initiative for a creature is, and then lower this by 1 value. So generally the way that I do it is I would go 20.9. And yes, you can use decimals. That guarantees that it's going to stick around for the duration of the turn of the adult dragon when it circles back around, and then fall off before the next player goes, because players are never going to have a decimal-based initiative, unless it's been manually put there by a dungeon master. And as you can see, now that we advance past the turn of the dragon, the effect falls off. This is something that you'll want to be cognizant of when you're dealing with effects. If it's something that is meant to exist until the end of that particular creature's turn that applied the effect, you need to adjust the initiative roll. If it's meant to expire at the end of the round, you have to delete the initiative roll that's in that field. If it's meant to simply expire at the time that that particular creature or player's turn rolls around again, then you don't have to touch a thing. It'll automatically do that for you. The last thing that I want to go over in relation to the effect is this target reticle. If this creature, and I'm going to set this to all for now, if this barbarian, I should say, attacks a creature, then the attack bonus and the damage bonus is going to come into play. But what happens if that is meant to be restricted to dragons? I.e., maybe they have a particular sword that has a special condition that when someone attacks a dragon, there's an additional damage that comes through. What you can do is you can drag this effect icon up to the target in question, and you'll see that it will list it as a target. Now, if this barbarian chose to attack an orc that happens to be in the combat tracker that's not here now, then what would happen is this attack +1 and that damage +2 would not apply to the orc at all. It would only be applicable to any attacks made against this dragon. That's how you can control the behavior of these effects, if you will, with respect to incoming targets. And if you look at any of my class-specific videos where I have a particular effect that requires that kind of condition, I do demonstrate how that works. So if you're stuck on a particular feature associated with the class, there's a good chance I've got a video for that you can then go ahead and reference your players to, or give it to your players for reference, or you can set it up for them so that it functions and explain to them how to use it. Because players can do this as well. They will be able to drop this target reticle onto a particular creature that their effect is meant to attach to. As I've already covered the removal and the add effect, the only thing that is left is this icon here. You might have seen me use it a couple of times already, and that's just simply an information sheet. If you click on it for an adult dragon, you will get their NPC sheet. If you click on it for a player, you'll get their character sheet. So it's not an overly complicated icon to get to know and learn. It's a very simple pop it open. You've got the information you're looking for if you need a little bit more detail than what the combat tracker provides for you. It's the quick link functionality, essentially. At the bottom, there are a few other things that we haven't yet gone around and covered. We've already gone over this actor indicator, the token, it's right there. We've already shown you how to advance a turn using this next actor button, but there is a menu here that has a little bit more functionality rather than just anything that controls initiative. It also gives you the ability to close the combat window, so you can actually just simply close that out. You have a trash can icon that can delete foes or all non-friendly creatures, so anyone that isn't an ally or green would be removed from the combat tracker. It doesn't matter whether it's an object, whether it's a creature, or some form of trap, really doesn't much matter, it will remove it. Next, you have the ability to delete effects. So you can actually remove all effects, and that would include effects that don't have a duration expiration associated with them, or anything that has a particular effect that expires after an X number of rounds. So this one has 1 round that it would expire. If I click that, it's going to go away. You also have the ability to trigger rest from here. So you have the ability to trigger a short rest or a long rest, but keep in mind it's going to affect creatures that are inside of the combat tracker. So if you are just trying to control the rest period for the party members, you're going to want to make use of the party sheet to be able to do that. You don't want to necessarily do that here. So if I execute a rest, for example, you'll see that the initiative is cleared, and in this case the wounds didn't go away, but if I do a long rest, the wounds will go away. And we've already gone over the faction indicators, but the last thing we haven't really gone over is this element down here. This is the round that your combat scenario is running through. So in this case, we're in round 1. If I go ahead, and that resets whenever you execute a long rest, in case you hadn't noticed that, or a short rest. You can, however, advance the turn. So you can very quickly advance the turn to the next round, and it's automatically going to not necessarily roll initiatives, but it's always going to select the first item that is listed within the combat tracker and make that the active actor in that particular turn. And for the most part, that is everything that you need to know when it comes to the combat tracker as a dungeon master. You can also create an item and then manually populate it, but that is a lot more complicated of a task because you have to go through and link and create a creature and do a whole bunch of other stuff that chances are you're not going to do when you're trying to set up a quick encounter of some kind. As you can see, the combat tracker has a large number of features integrated into it, and this works in conjunction with other aspects of the panel, such as the character sheet, the maps, NPC information sheets, and a slew of other areas, including these encounter elements. This is why I always say the combat tracker is one of the most important panels within Fantasy Grounds Unity, with respect to executing an efficient combat-based encounter. If you have not already done so, I highly recommend that you watch the player version of this particular video, because it's going to show you exactly what the players see, that you can understand what limitations they are working under and be able to sort of provide them information if it's required to be able to help them move forward with their combat scenario. And finally, consider watching the example encounter video, as that's going to run you through a detailed encounter with a number of different kinds of situations as part of that encounter to show you how it works. I want to thank you for watching this video on behalf of Smiteworks and myself. I also want to thank SmiteWorks for providing me the opportunity to present this information on their channel, and I look forward to continuing with our collaboration. Please click on the like button if you found the information in this video useful to helping you learn how to use Fantasy Grounds Unity, specifically the combat tracker in this case, and consider subscribing to the SmiteWorks Fantasy Grounds YouTube channel to keep up to date with new content as it is released. If you have any questions or comments about this video, feel free to post them in the comment section of the video below for others to see and contribute to the discussion.